Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the virtual Nightcap Roundtable brought to you by the Institute of the Americas, sponsored by Control Risks. We're pleased to have a pretty unique topic for our discussion today, and one we think will incentivize and provide a lot of space for conversation with you, the audience. We've got two directors, the director Jonathan Wood and Raul Gallegos from the firm Control Risks. And I think many of you know them. And Raul has done a lot of work on the Venezuela. He's a journalist by training. Spent many years. I think Wall Street Journal, Reuters. You did the Bloomberg. I think you did them all, right? All
the trifecta. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jonathan Wood is based in Washington D.C. and runs the U.S. practice, as it were, and that's Control Risk, right, Jonathan?
That's right. That's right.
So you're well placed there in D.C. to start us off. So let's do that. I think the idea here is that Jonathan will offer some preliminary thoughts, some outlines and some ideas about the U.S. election, about what Control Risks in their analysis and in their discussions are seeing or are looking at. And then we'll see if there's some questions, and then we'll go to Raul, who will complement some of Jonathan's thoughts on the broader regional, so weaving in sort of implications for Latin America based upon U.S. election, U.S. electoral trend lines. So without further ado, Jonathan, over to you, and we look forward to this conversation. Thanks again for your support this year.
Our pleasure, Jeremy. Thank you, and thank you for having us, and good afternoon, good evening to all of those on the line from around the world. I think both Raul and I would like to foment a hopefully very interesting discussion, and so we're going to keep our remarks pretty short. To get it started. And in that vein, I would just like to make three main points about how we're seeing the U.S. election and what kind of implications it might have for the Western Hemisphere and Latin America region. The first is, and this is probably predates some of the recent polling, we have now crafted our most likely scenario to be that former Vice President Biden will win the election as a result of the economic crisis due to COVID-19. But unlike some other forecasters, we do think this will still be a close election that comes down to a handful of swing states. And we still see a lot of uncertainty around the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the election process itself, including the degree to which it potentially increases the risk of a contested election in the US, but also around the sheer voting mechanics, both in terms of turnout. This was previously forecast to be a record turnout election, and that seems no longer likely to be the case. And also in terms of voting mechanisms, where even in the past few days, there's been some question about just how much postal voting and other forms of alternative voting might come to bear on the election. So we still see that as a significant source of uncertainty for the outlook, and in a close election could well be decisive in some of the key swing states that were important in 2016 and we think will be important this year as well. Now, in terms of what the election will be about, as much as it seems as though President Trump and the Republican Party want to make this election about China, about its response to COVID-19, about the U.S. kind of strategic position in the world, we still see this as being an election that is largely about domestic policy and political issues, especially the economy, especially healthcare, both of which continue to poll and consistently have done so, and as among the most significant issues that voters are concerned about. And we think that COVID-19 will accentuate and reinforce that trend in voter preferences. But there's certainly an interesting wrinkle there, and one that perhaps pertains to the reason, and that is that with Latinx voters now the largest minority demographic in the 2020 election, we expect immigration to also be a significant issue, and perhaps some more focused policy issues such as sanctions on Venezuela that play to key constituencies in swing states like Florida or Arizona. And then finally, when we think about what U.S. policy towards the region might look like, both over the coming months and potentially as a result of a change in administration, over the course of the coming months, we do expect to see some degree of continuity, both in terms of the harder edges of sanctions policy towards Venezuela, Cuba, trade policy, and immigration. But if there were a change in administration, we would expect to see a Democratic administration revert to or attempt to revert to the status quo ante under former President Obama, which is to say a policy of engagement, multilateralism, trade, human rights, and some of the more traditional issues that have defined U.S. foreign policy in the region, especially when it comes to countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina, and a few others. But I think there's also an important change here that has emerged over the last few years and was certainly underway before that, and that is the degree to which the U.S. strategic lens in foreign policy has shifted very firmly towards competition with China, even as it attempts to dispense with some of its legacy commitments in the Middle East and other regions. And so while Latin America is a part of that competition, is certainly a theater of that competition, we don't see it as necessarily becoming the focal point of U.S. foreign policy under either party administration for the next 4 years. It will continue to be something that where there are situational issues that U.S. policymakers feel as though they have to deal with, but where the strategic attention is most likely to be focused on Asia and to some degree on the Middle East. So perhaps, Jeremy, I'll leave it there. There's certainly a lot more that can be said, but I want to give everyone an opportunity to chime in and certainly hopefully get a discussion going.
No, that's perfect, Jonathan. And I think we've had the pleasure of the three of us sitting around the room in La Jolla and doing this before, so you understand perfectly how we're trying to prime the pump. Let me ask you something really quick before we go to one of the questions here, because you pointed out something I think that cannot be emphasized enough for people joining us from across the region and outside the U.S., and that is that the United States is basically a 50-state election presidential system, right? The Electoral College, which I think, for better or worse, people around the world better have an understanding to a certain degree of now. But we cannot emphasize enough just how, as you said, there will be key swing states that will decide this election. So my first question to you, before we throw another one in, is give us the 5 key swing states, Jonathan. If you want 5, 3, 6, you choose.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think that you make a really good point there, Jeremy, because not only is the U.S. presidential election a series of state elections, actually, and I think we're all unfortunately going to become very familiar with the sort of mechanics of the Electoral College this cycle. The U.S. Constitution and federal law do not actually explicitly require a popular election either to the presidency. That is something that is required by state law, but some scenarios for this election have kind of raised the prospect of what might happen if legislatures that were controlled by state legislatures controlled by the opposition party decided to change state law in terms of allocating electors under the Electoral College system. So for those who are kind of political or policy wonks, there's a huge universe of scenarios you can run out there. But our baseline scenario is that as a result of COVID-19, this election is not going to be, delayed. It really can't be delayed for both constitutional and statutory reasons, and is unlikely to be attempted anyway. And we do expect to see an election that is run more or less in an orderly fashion, which is to say a series of state popular elections conducted according to prevailing state law. And that will include some, routine voting and some postal voting and some alternative measures that have to be established for physical distancing in the wake of COVID-19, but largely a kind of predictable process where the main variable is going to be, how many people turn out, how many people send in postal ballots. And that's why we think that these swing states are going to be so important, because when you look back at 2016, let's just take the 6 swing states right across the middle of the pivot in the Electoral College. They were Florida, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New Hampshire, all of which were decided with sub 1% margins, right? And in some cases, when you think about the really decisive states in 2016, Michigan, Wisconsin, these are sort of sub half point percentage margins. In some cases where tens of thousands of votes were decisive in terms of who wound up winning that state. And so even a very small difference in turnout among specific constituencies could be extremely important to determining who wins Florida, for example, or who wins Michigan, who wins Pennsylvania. And so those states, we still see those as being very decisive. There are a few interesting things to point out about these swing states, of course. states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, these haven't necessarily been the hardest hit in terms of infections and transmission of COVID-19. There you're looking at your New York City and Seattle, maybe Houston, but they certainly have been among the states that have been hardest hit economically by the recession. And so that could be a very significant factor, and one where we see essentially weighing against President Trump, mostly because independent voters in these states were voting very strongly on sort of pocketbook and kitchen table issues. But I think it's also where, and Raul and I, and you have had many discussions about this as well, in a state like Florida, where U.S. policy towards the Latin America region, or in parts of the Southwest U.S. where you have large Latinx voter constituencies, where immigration policy is a big issue, those could wind up being very significant, maybe even decisive issues in these swing states. And one thing that we're seeing now with former Vice President Biden is thinking about ways that he could use immigration in particular as a wedge issue to expand the Democratic map to some of those traditionally Republican states in the South, Florida, Arizona, maybe even Texas. Probably not this cycle, but potentially in the future. I mean, there is certainly a sentiment that with very narrow margins, some of these more niche policy issues could become very important.
No, super, and I'm glad you mentioned Arizona, because it is interesting to see what will happen there. I've got a couple more questions, and Raul, bear with us, and then we'll get to the region. But if you don't mind, there's a couple interesting questions here. Just sort of reset the presidential election, if you will, and then who the two candidates are, just to reconfirm everything. And then in that answer, I think somebody's posed a question, Jorge, thanks for this question. There's been some interest. I think Governor Cuomo, with his managing of COVID-19 and his daily press conferences, people sort of maybe saw him as a late entrant. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, both great questions. So just to level set the situation, we are now in a position where President Trump, the incumbent, will be running against former Vice President Joe Biden, so Obama's vice president. And Biden wrapped up the Democratic nomination with sort of little fanfare last month after Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders dropped out of the campaign. When we were talking about the U.S. election, even 2 or 3 months ago, we were looking at a Democratic ticket, which was very unclear. You had a very large slate of candidates, over 20 candidates. They were representing quite a broad cross-section of ideological currents in the Democratic Party, from very progressive democratic socialist Bernie Sanders, who had very different concepts of foreign policy, including towards the Latin America region, to establishment centrists like Joe Biden, to even some, what might be considered more very moderate Democrats like Senator Amy Klobuchar from the upper Midwest. Ultimately, that race did distill down to a contest between fairly establishment Democratic policy platform in many ways, manifested by Joe Biden, who has essentially promised has pledged to return to the Obama era policies in many different dimensions. And of course, the more insurgent and to some degree disruptive platform of President Trump, which includes aspects of both traditional Republican policy orthodoxy, for example, around economic policy, but also some more populist issues, especially when it comes to things like trade. I think the USMCA negotiations between the US, Canada, and Mexico that have played out and just recently been implemented, or will be implemented rather, on the 1st of July, are really an interesting example of how both parties have converged on a different and new and more progressive consensus around trade that is likely to be the case going forward. Now, as to your second question about who else might jump in the race, there was a brief discussion of a third-party candidacy by a fairly high-profile House member called Justin Amash, who was ejected from the Republican Party and was maybe going to run on a Libertarian ticket. His candidacy was interesting in this domain of very narrow margins because he represents a swing district in Michigan where potentially he could pull enough votes from one or both candidates to tip that state. But he's recently said he's not going to run. So we are looking at a fairly conventional election where there will be third-party candidates, Libertarian, Green, a few other parties, but nobody who's likely to be transformative in terms of the race dynamic, which is essentially, and has been for the last 3 years, do you support or do you oppose President Trump and the administration? Now, Joe Biden's running mate, which I see here in the comment, is an interesting question. Certainly people like Andrew Cuomo, who have become very prominent as a result of the crisis. You can think of a few other Democratic and Republican governors nationwide as well. They undoubtedly harbor higher political ambitions that I think we'll see play out over the course of the next few years. But in this cycle, Vice President Biden has a few key conditions that he's thinking about for his running mate in the race. He needs to satisfy a generational divide, a racial divide, and a gender divide. And he's essentially come out and he said in a previous Democratic debate, that he would look to run with a woman of color on the ticket. And so within the Democratic Party, there are some very prominent names that are being discussed, and certainly some people who are campaigning hard for the position. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Senator Kamala Harris from California, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. They would each bring different strengths to the Biden ticket. But we think that we're going to be looking at a running mate who helps Biden with a younger and certainly more diverse and cosmopolitan Democratic electorate, and somebody in particular who can help Biden bridge the gap to those more progressive voters who had been very strongly backing Bernie Sanders. And that includes most Latinx voters who voted in the Democratic primary. Most of them, they went very heavily for Sanders. And so this has been a big area of outreach from the Biden campaign over the last month, and will be a big focus over the coming months as well. And I think the vice presidential pick will play into that dynamic.
No, it's fantastic. It's all super fascinating, and I think we could come back. Let's invite Raul to bring it into the region, or bring, I should say, the region into the conversation. So, we talked about perhaps the role in some of the states of the diaspora. In the case of Florida, particularly, sort of the Trump administration vis-a-vis the Maduro regime has been a very important topic, right? But talk to us, what's your thinking, Raul? Bring this to the region. What are the implications for the region this cycle?
Sure. And well, first of all, thanks as always for having us. I think, piggybacking on some of the comments Jonathan made, I think obviously, given the level of crisis that COVID-19 has represented to the U.S. and continues to represent, and the impact that we're going to see economically in the U.S., and also the impact on a number of U.S. companies, I think it will be sort of the temptation to look inward and focus on the domestic arena rather than focusing externally or globally is going to certainly be there, right? Especially, I mean, even in our base case, which is a Democrat certainly winning. We will see certainly a government after the election that is going to be tempted to look inward, but at the same time, because this has meant such a punishment for the economy and for a number of U.S. companies, there's also going to be a drive to help or engage internationally to make sure that the interests of these companies are advanced, if you will. And so, I think we can see that certainly when it comes to the case of Mexico, for instance. I mean, in the case of Mexico, obviously the big issues are, regardless of administration, are likely going to revolve around trade, energy security, and certainly immigration, especially if we continue to see a Trump administration in office, right? We have seen under the Trump administration how President Trump has been able to establish a sort of a working relationship with AMLO in Mexico, particularly on the immigration front, doing something about Central Americans moving north, less so on the drugs, a little bit more on trade with, successfully, automotive companies, for example, successfully lobbied to sort of reopen the industry in Mexico. We're likely to see a little bit more lobbying from renewable energy companies, especially now as AMLO has become a little bit more forceful on the electricity front. But in my view, I mean, if we see as base case scenario Democrats coming into office, we're going to see a government that will privilege certainly reestablishing or re-enhancing the trade side of the equation when it comes to the interests the U.S. has in the region. Yes, security with drug trafficking, et cetera, will remain certainly an issue regardless of the administration, but we are going to see a shift from a more immigration-focused approach, which has been sort of the Trump mantra for a long time, to a more, let's re-engage economically, let's strengthen our economic relationships, the way that, we've seen in the past, certainly more liberal-minded governments in the U.S. have sort of focused on, right? Trump has certainly been much more aggressive on the front of immigration, and in our view, certainly we're likely to continue to see that as prior to the election, right? If we continue to go south, obviously when we are at sort of a region where, which is of interest to the energy space as well, Venezuela, Guyana, and Colombia, for instance, there obviously the interest is much more energy focused. In the case of Guyana, for instance, obviously, I'm sure we can talk about a little bit more about that, but in the case of Guyana, we're seeing essentially what it looks like a government trying to steal an election. So far, that's, what we're seeing based on some of the early numbers and, some of the moves that the government has taken. Now, in that case, obviously, oil is of massive interest. We have Exxon, obviously, positioned there, and a number of other Western companies as well. In that case, for instance, regardless of the administration, we wouldn't expect to see a U.S. become very aggressive with sanctions or any other sort of punishing measures, considering that this is a budding oil sector, oil economy, that you have a number of Western companies operating there, that you want to have a sort of a working relationship, if you will. So if we did see something, it would probably be to the extent of a slap on the wrist, rather than, a souring of the relationship that could put oil investment, at risk, if you will. In Colombia, obviously, defense, security issues are going to remain preeminent, especially when it comes to the drug trade. In Colombia, obviously, we have the whole debate about fracking. In our view, we don't see the U.S. sort of leaning one way or the other, or trying to sort of lean on the Colombian government to speed up or open up or otherwise make it easier for fracking to actually occur. There's a lot of legal hurdles here that unfortunately fracking is facing. And in the case of Venezuela, obviously there we have a different reality. In that case, in our view, if a Democrat comes into office, we're going to see probably a loss of focus, if you will, on trying to bring political change, certainly less focus on tightening sanctions to make sure that political change happens. We have to remember that in the case of Biden, obviously he was part of the administration that actually lifted sanctions from Cuba. So, there is certainly a strand within the Democrats that, just doesn't believe sanctions are effective, and that they're probably not the best way to engage these folks, right? Say illiberal regimes or dictatorial regimes, if you will. So in our view, the more likely case is in the case of a Biden administration, we would see something. We wouldn't see lifting of sanctions outright, but we would certainly see, not making it sort of the main focus. In the case of a continued Trump presence, we do see sanctions tightening ahead of the election, but I think given the impact that COVID-19 has meant to the economy in the U.S. and the impact it has meant for the energy space as well, it would not surprise me if, regardless of administration, we saw even a Trump administration getting fed up with the fact that, regime change did not come, and becoming more open to lobbying from energy companies to make it more viable to engage with, an established dictatorship, which doesn't seem to want to go away, right? So I think that the fact that some of these companies have been punished so much during COVID-19 is precisely an opportunity, I think, for a lot of them to knock on the door of the administration and say, listen, I know you don't like this regime, but we have work to do. There might be new terms that might be offered in the future, and we have business to do. So I think there might be an interesting sort of opportunity there for a slight adjustment in the way sanctions are being used. And then obviously if we go further south, in the case of Brazil and Argentina, in the case of Brazil, I think The relationship certainly is not about immigration. We do see a lot of concern by the U.S. about the relationship with China, and certainly the 5G telecom sort of bidding, and whether China will have success in that front. We don't see Brazil actually shunning the Chinese just to please the U.S. in that sense. I think the relationship between China, and the commercial relationship between China and Brazil will grow strong. But we do see, for example, a situation where, Brazil and Argentina are certainly seeking the support of the U.S. in joining the OECD. So in that sense, there might be a little back and forth in some areas, both in Brazil and Argentina on that front. But Argentina obviously is in a very difficult situation once again, and they're seeking IMF help. So there's going to be an interesting dynamic with the U.S., the IMF, and Argentina on that front. But I think it's much more commerce related, it's much more business related and diplomacy related, the interests and the relationship between the U.S. and Brazil and Argentina, than it becomes as we go north in the region. At this point, I'm going to leave it at that, but certainly open to questions.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I think, we talked a little bit of their day with the DOE about the U.S.-Brazil energy. We heard from the State Department yesterday about some of the engagement, the critical minerals, particularly a lot of talk about governance and trying to work with the hemisphere on critical minerals. Implicitly, therefore, China, dealing with China. Let's ask this question, because I'll go to Raul, but if Jonathan wants to weigh in, it's regarding candidates' vision on environment and developments of energy in Latin America. So, we have in the U.S. this debate about the Green New Deal. I think that's what we're calling it. Anyway, so what's sort of talk about, Raul, what you think of a Trump second term or a Biden first term in terms of energy and environment with Latin America? And then, Jonathan, if you want to compliment. But first, let's go to Raul.
I think that will certainly be part of the discourse to some extent, right? But I don't see a U.S. administration becoming so animate or involved, if you will, in driving home broader environmental issues in Latin America. I think, it's a commodity play, Latin America. It has been always a commodity, reliant region. It will continue to be. It is where a number of U.S. companies in the commodity space and the energy space, and certainly coal, oil, et cetera, continue to operate. So, and there's so much traction you can get, or response you can get, or advancement you can get from some of these governments in that front. So, I would say it will remain an issue from a rhetorical point of view, but I don't see any, major pressure or advances being made on that front under either administration, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Our outlook for the energy sector under a change, under a post-U.S. election scenario is, if we have a second Trump term, very strong promotion of U.S. domestic energy development, certainly exports to the region as well. If we have a Biden administration, to your point about the Green New Deal, there's an explicit policy there, which is to significantly increase investments in renewables and rejoin the Paris Agreement and reduce some legacy fossil fuel production and developments in the U.S. specifically, and encourage the reduction of those abroad. There's certainly talk within the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and this was one of the platform issues for Bernie Sanders, for example, of a border carbon tax on goods that were coming from countries that used a high proportion of coal in their energy mix, for example. So some of those issues are absolutely circulating on the Democratic side, but it's not going to be, certainly not under a Biden administration, a really revolutionary or activist environmental push abroad. I think there will be some very significant policies within the U.S. that could well have implications for the region. So, for example, maybe reduced investment in U.S., maybe increases investment outside of the U.S. in oil and gas or something like that. Reduced investment in the fracking industry in particular could well become an issue for companies. But where we do see that sort of playing out in that international domain, maybe some efforts to introduce more stringent environmental chapters and requirements into some of the trade negotiations and trade relations that the U.S. is working out with other countries. So maybe not the countries that it already has free trade agreements with in the region, but for future trade negotiations, things like environment, labor, human rights, these are becoming more a part of that conversation and would be more likely to be inserted under a Democratic administration than under
Correct.
a Republican administration.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that leads to, well, so one of the last on the NOC Outlook panel, we sort of had this a bit of a lighthearted moment. Multilateralism is dead. I think Francisco Monaldi said about the public bad. We always talk about public goods, and what COVID-19 has now produced for us is how we manage a public bad. So I guess the question is that a distinction? It sounds like from so far what you've been saying, perhaps it is. Multilateralism is revived under a Biden presidency, and perhaps another nail in the coffin under a second Trump term. Without putting words in your mouth, does that seem?
Over to you.
No, well, I think it's clear that a Trump administration is certainly not part of the political those politicians that believe in exporting liberal values abroad. You know what I mean? That's not a focus. It's more of looking at those areas of international politics that benefit me as the U.S., benefit us. Making sure that there are certain things I can do internationally that will benefit me domestically. As nationalism, I think, and populism are winning out in a number of countries around the world. I think that's not new. I think if we look at those countries that are considered liberal democracies and we count them, out of the 190 countries around the world, we're going to see there are less than half. I mean, that's just the reality. I mean, we just happen to be lucky to live in liberal democracies, but most countries are not or are imperfect. And so I think that it's going to be a challenge going forward, certainly if we see another Trump administration, and certainly if we see, similar individuals like Trump coming to power in other liberal democracies.
To which I would add, I think in terms of that phase shift that you described there, Jeremy, or maybe a reversion towards multilateralism, I do think we'll see that from two key areas that we need to pay attention to. The first is one of the stories for business of the Trump administration has been opacity and uncertainty about how policy is being developed. So there's, there are different competing agency and other interests within the government, and it's never clear on any particular issue whether the hawks are going to have it or the moderates, and ultimately Trump kind of makes a decision which sometimes appears externally as quite abrupt. And this was a very sharp contrast from the Obama administration, which was maybe a little bit like death by committee. But I do think that a Democratic administration or even a different Republican administration would move back towards a more predictable policymaking process, in which companies that were U.S. companies investing in the region or stakeholders in the region itself would be able to understand sort of what was driving policy and where was it likely to end up. So we'd have a more predictable process. That might be sort of one domestic issue that would play out. But I do think that COVID will have an interesting, maybe even salutary impact on multilateralism, simply because the U.S., like every other country globally, is suffering an extremely deep economic crisis. And more than most countries globally, it is spending liberally to try and get out of this. But this, going forward, and certainly for the next administration, is going to reduce its fiscal capacity to maybe grapple with some international issues and make it even more important to rely on what we used to call, the U.S. alliance system, partnerships, allies, engagement, diplomacy, because those are much lower cost in some ways than trying to do everything yourself or else just suffering the consequences. So I do think there will be a move, and we're starting to see this within the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is to say we need to focus our resources and attention on sort of rebuilding at home, very consistent with what Raul says, and work a little bit more through institutions, partners, and allies to offload some of the costs and commitments that we have overseas.
Yeah, we've been hearing that's for certain. I mean, that's not unique to the U.S. for sure. By the way, Raul, you talk about Western liberals, and I think in Trump's mind that includes the fruits and nuts out here in California, right? We're a bunch of Western liberals. So, okay,
Right.
moving. There's
Another
a
type of liberal, but yes.
Yeah, no, that's the moderately inside joke, but he did say one time something about Western liberals. Those like San Francisco's the epitome of Western liberals. So, wow, thanks everyone for these wonderful questions. I'm going to jump here. I think we talked a little bit. Let's grab Milton Chavez's question here about. I think we talked a little bit about this, but just reaffirm your thought, Raul, on if Biden is elected and Milton puts in entre comillas, would we see a reverse totally toward Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua?
Interesting. Oh, sorry, I was reading the Wall Street question, not the other one. Yeah.
Oh, well, we'll get to that one. I'm sorry. I'm
trying. Okay. I'm sorry. So could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. So the question here is: if Biden is elected in November, will the current U.S. policy reverse totally towards Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua? And then he mixes in what about countries such as Russia and Iran? So maybe you take the Latin America, and then we'll ask Jonathan about Russia and Iran.
Sure. No, I think that I wouldn't say a complete reversion. Say, I think that the State Department, the Justice Department, for instance, which has indicted Maduro and others. I mean, in a way, these are institutions that will carry on that job for some time. I would say that under a Biden administration, you would probably see an initial pause, the adjustment of the changing in the administration, et cetera. And, there's a point at which Biden would have to decide if this is a priority, if pressuring these governments is actually getting anywhere, and whether he wants to devote energy to that front. I don't think that it would be an immediate complete lifting. I think it would be a deprioritization to start. And then we would probably see, depending on the amount of lobbying that we see in Washington from the part of companies trying to do business in some of these countries, a little bit of adjustments to allow some of these companies to more freely operate, right? So to me, that would be my view on the process of how that would play out. But no, I wouldn't say they would get scot-free. But I would say that certainly it would be a celebratory thing for some of these regimes because they would feel that the amount of pressure that they're seeing under a Trump administration would not happen under a Democrat administration.
Maybe the spotlight is not as intense, Jonathan?
Well, so I think, there's probably two ways to answer this. The first is when it comes to Cuba specifically, Biden has said, I will return to the Obama administration policy. I mean, how much of that he's able to actually engineer and get through Congress is maybe an open question, but the intention is to return to a policy of relaxing sanctions incrementally in exchange for certain concessions. So I think we would see some sort of, light switch reversion there when it comes to that policy. And something similar to with respect to Iran, where, again, Trump came into office and sort of was delayed in the onset, but ultimately executed a policy of completely dismantling the Obama administration's Iran policy. Biden would come into office with the objective of reversing that policy and returning to the Obama era status quo ante, again, rejoining the Iran nuclear deal and coming up with some arrangement that would allow for a relaxation of sanctions on Iran in exchange for concessions around its nuclear program. And I think now, even within the Democratic Party, the consensus on Iran has moved towards the more center or center-right position of, we need to also put restrictions on Iran's regional and global activities. So one of the things which is interesting, and certainly something that is playing out, this very week as Iranian tankers or other vessels are en route to, Venezuela, is we see some of those provocations that involve Iran, some of Iran's activities in Latin America region, and certainly the elevated tensions between Iran and the U.S. as, stemming from the fact that there's this very hardline policy in both countries. If we move back towards a more accommodative policy from the U.S. side, it might reduce Iran's intent to carry out what are fairly costly and of dubious benefit, extra regional missions in Latin America and other countries. Of course, it does have a sort of asymmetric presence there, but in terms of trying to directly challenge the U.S. in Latin America, Iran may decide that that's one thing it can safely dispense with if there's a new nuclear deal that results in sanctions relaxation. I mean, as for Russia, I don't think that there's any appetite in either party at the moment to really pursue some rapprochement or significant engagement. Of course, the Democrats still blame Russia very directly for election interference and anticipate that in this current cycle there may be further such actions like that. And so that relationship is going to remain very tense, and I think sanctions will continue to be a big part of it. Bear in mind that the sanctions regime that the U.S. has applied towards Russia, which the Trump administration has continued and intensified, but not for lack of talking about maybe relaxing it at some point. This was set up under the Obama administration. Biden was, of course, involved in those programs, and it relates very much to a continuing conflict in eastern Ukraine. So unless there's really any movement on those issues, I would expect to see relative continuity on the Russia issue. And as a result, continued concern about Russia's interventions or involvement in what would still be perceived as the U.S.'s backyard in Central and South America. Raul, yeah, sorry.
Raul? Okay, he's technical difficulties. Raul, hold on a second. It's not. You may have to reset. We can't hear you. Let me start. Let's pivot this. Well, there's a question from Jonathan Thomas. We want to get to your question, but let's bring in a couple of the domestic questions here. Richard talks about the the high level of COVID and infections in swing states that you were talking about earlier, and he wants to He wants us to talk a little bit about the jobs versus health, and just exactly if we take those swing states specifically, the role of COVID-19 in this election and what they mean for the swing states. And then there's also that question about the Wall Street. But let's take the COVID-19 in the swing states, and does that, as you noted earlier, change the dynamic enough to swing them the other way?
Yeah, Richard makes a great question, which is around how several of the closest fought swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida in particular, are among the top 10 in terms of total U.S. COVID caseload. And I might add that actually these are also states, Florida especially because it started to reopen earlier, where cases are continuing to accelerate in different parts of the state. So these are states that we fully expect by the time the election rolls around to continue, still be dealing with a significant public health crisis. And now in terms of its impact on the election, in terms of its impact upon the tight margins that might well determine this election, there's two things to consider. The first is that some of these states, Michigan in particular, but Florida, when you think of the tourism economy, these have been very hard hit and will remain very hard hit by the economic consequences of COVID-19. And heading into this election cycle, President Trump was running almost on a very monotone message of having delivered historically low unemployment, historically high stock market performance, robust U.S. growth, some of the best globally among large economies. That story doesn't work now that the U.S. is facing its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And in particular, for many independent voters in these states who were swayed by that economic message, I think by the time that they begin to firm up their election preferences, which historically takes place around the middle of the year, so think July, August timeframe when the U.S. will still be in a deep recession, they may be shifting in decisive margins, that is to say, independent voters towards Vice President Biden or maybe towards a third-party candidate. And you see this in some of the polling in particular. President Trump hit some of his highest approval ratings in mid-March after declaring a national emergency to deal with COVID-19. But as the impacts have accumulated, including in these key swing states, while his approval rating among Republican voters remains very, very high, 85+%, his approval rating among those independent voters has fallen by 5 or 6 points. So that is really the decisive demographic that we're looking at, and I think the one that will be decisive in this election. And the second factor is, and this is another one that's very important, when you think about the composition of the U.S. electorate itself, President Trump has banked on and certainly benefited from older voters, and who vote both very consistently and tend to vote more conservatively as well. And older voter polling has also indicated a deterioration of support because of the very high mortality rates in assisted care facilities, perceptions that the government wasn't doing enough to respond to the kind of particular health needs of older voters. And especially, as you say, this trade-off between jobs and health is being read among sort of older voting constituencies as, we're being sacrificed for the greater good. So I think there's certainly some potential for erosion in a state like Florida, which has a relatively high proportion of older voters among that key demographic. And this is most likely to benefit Biden only because some of the voters that Democrats really rely on, young people, people of color, urban, people who live in urban areas, they vote at much lower rates. If you think of Latinx voters in the U.S. are voting at about 40%, older voters in the U.S. are voting about 65, 70%. So, if you can't maybe increase outreach as much as you'd like because of COVID, you can't knock on doors, you can't drive people to the polls as part of a traditional voter outreach campaign, you might well take the fact that some older voters are either going to switch tickets or stay home because they would probably have voted for President Trump.
No, it's an excellent point about turnout in the older voters, the demographic. They vote. I mean, bottom line. Raul, can we hear it? No. Unfortunately, you might have to log out and log back in to reset the video audio feed. Sorry about that. We'll be here if you could go back. There we go. Yeah, too bad. Hopefully we'll get him back here in a minute. Jonathan's like, well, okay, I'll be forced to.
Just no hard questions about Venezuela, please.
Yeah, no, we'll hold the Venezuela stuff. So let's do this. Let's take this question about Wall Street, corporate America. It is an age-old debate over Republican versus Democratic administrations vis-a-vis business, vis-a-vis regulation, and just how they are their appeal to the corporate set in Wall Street, America, and that part. So talk about that.
That's a great question, and it's fortunately one that's fairly straightforward to answer, which is to say, Wall Street is very comfortable with Biden among Democrats that were campaigning for the nomination. Biden, as you may or may not know, was for many decades a senator from Delaware. Delaware being one of the states in the U.S. that has among the highest concentrations of corporate registrations, financial services industry. And he cultivated very close linkages to the industry and certainly was instrumental in legislative initiatives that were beneficial to the industry over the years. And so he's a known quantity from a policy perspective, and the policies that he's articulated have been fairly friendly towards financial services compared to people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who really want to see much tighter financial sector regulation and in some cases punitive regulation.
Yeah.
Biden's policy agenda towards financial services, towards Wall Street, he talks a lot about Main Street. His campaign is built around his image, especially in these upper sort of Rust Belt swing states, as a kind of Main Street politician. But his policies towards Wall Street effectively consist of reapplying some of the regulations that went in with Dodd-Frank. So not necessarily dramatic expansion of new regulations, but maybe a tightening of the existing regulatory regime. And that includes things like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has been deprioritized, let's say, under the Trump administration. And it consists of some increased tax rates for both high earners and corporations, but nowhere near the levels that were being contemplated by either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. So broadly, fairly comfortable with Biden. He's viewed as a centrist Democrat, and centrist Democrats have traditionally had a fairly stable and even productive relationship with Wall Street.
Excellent. Thank you, Raul.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Excellent.
Okay, good. Excellent. I'm I'm sorry. So, what I was
What
going
were
to
you going to
say
say? I'm sure you had some amazing
10
thoughts.
minutes ago.
Well, let's do this. Let's take Jonathan's
ahead.
question. Let's take Jonathan's question because, Jonathan Wood said no questions on Venezuela while you were rebooting. So Jonathan Gupton says, in your view, and let's direct this to Raul, what makes Venezuela unique? The current administration is willing to engage with leaders that have been less than democratic bona fides and not willing to engage with Maduro. You all can see the question, hopefully. I think it's a continuation of this intersection of domestic politics, domestic demographics in Florida, and what that means for a regional, approach politically or policy-wise. Okay.
No, I think the electoral component is certainly undeniable. I mean, it's a very important component. Trump has gone out of his way more than any other president, particularly obviously because the situation in Venezuela is what it is right now. But beyond that, obviously has gone beyond what any other president has done in trying to engage with the opposition and trying to make Venezuela a major issue, right? But I think, aside from that, I think it is important to understand that, the U.S. Remains sort of a liberal democracy that believes that liberal democratic ideals should be exported to the rest of the world, particularly to, its immediate sort of sphere of influence, right? Venezuela is a major oil producer. It will, not anymore, but used to be and hopefully will become again. And the reserves are there, and the interest of oil companies is there as well in sort of re-engaging in the best manner possible, right? So I think that what makes it important is a combination of both components, right? And because of that, it is my view that it is possible, and certainly not unthinkable, that even under a Trump administration, we would probably see a move toward deprioritizing, if you will, or making it slightly more conducive for some folks to continue to do business there, especially after the COVID-19 crisis and the impact it has had on major energy companies.
It's going to be fascinating. As you guys probably were there for the session about which NOC doesn't exist and which one is most critical, and somehow PDVSA won both, topped both polls, right? Which NOC won't exist and which one is most critical. So that there's talking about paradox. We're running out of time, which is always a shame. This has been fantastic, Jonathan, and Raul, as always. A couple of questions. Let me roll up a couple of things here into one, and then I'll end with a yes or no question that will be ridiculously complex for a yes or no question. Let's take Dario's question about sort of the huge need, and we've talked a bit about this, but just to come back to this, the huge need to address the economy, the recovery, what's just the shock to the system in the United States, and what will that mean for either administration, Trump 2 or Biden 1, in terms of Latin America. And then let's take this question Thomas posed, because it's a bit Armageddon-esque, if you will, but Trump loses in a landslide, but he doesn't actually leave the White House. He claims massive fraud. I mean, we've seen this kind of idea of claiming fraud. He lost the 2016 electoral or popular vote by 3 million, and he claimed there were 3 million illegal votes. No coincidence, I would suggest. So there you go. Is that a question of potential, what I call Armageddon, where a democratic process is contested? So two different questions, but let's take them together. Jonathan, over to you first. Raul, we'll let you weigh in as well, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Let me say the question about capacity is a great one, and one I think that the U.S. and countries in the region as well are really going to be grappling with for the next 2 or 3 years. When you look at the economic forecasts, and depending on how bad things get, we're not likely to get back to sort of current levels of GDP or current levels of growth until maybe 2022, 2023. So, and that's with accumulating a lot of new debt on top of some existing debt burdens, which are already unsustainable for certain countries. Think about Argentina or Ecuador. So we are looking at a situation over the next few years where there's going to be a kind of capacity deficit. And I think that applies as much to the US as well. Maybe an interesting analog will be, after the global financial crisis, it really was 2 or 3 years that the U.S. spent focusing mainly on domestic issues, what Obama called rebuilding at home, and allowing some of these international security challenges to either be ignored or downplayed, or just to fester and evolve without much U.S. attention. That's probably been part of the story of the last 10 years, really, has been an increased emphasis since the global financial crisis of U.S. policy on, kind of what's happening at home. And it certainly explains, I think, a lot, Jeremy, the rise of both President Trump within U.S. politics, real desire, palpable, to focus on the domestic economy, on America first, and not get involved in so much foreign adventurism in particular. And I think we're going to see a similar reaction after this crisis. There's one interesting dynamic that the U.S. is certainly a part of, and that is, the COVID-19 crisis is reinforcing some of the more populist claims from both the left and the right that we've seen and become familiar with over the last few years, whether these are about the dangers of globalization and global supply chains potentially being disrupted, or some of the populist claims around immigration, or some of the left-wing concerns about, we need a stronger welfare state and so on. And you're seeing COVID-19 really play into a lot of those debates. But at the same time, countries that currently have populist, what we might think of as populist governments, are performing sort of worse than average in terms of their ability to contain the COVID-19 crisis too. So there could well also be a political backlash against, populism, specific populist governments, even as some of the populist issues become, gain more mainstream support. Moving on to the sort of the second question about the U.S. election process. I mean, we think there's absolutely a plausible, if low likelihood scenario, that we will be in a contested election situation on November 4th. This, exactly as you say, Jeremy, the basic foundations for this are there, and COVID-19 is making them worse. We already have a significant loss of legitimacy in the electoral system in the U.S. as a result of both the 2016 election, but even going back to the 2000 election that was decided between then Vice President Gore and George Bush, where broadly this situation of being able to win a popular vote but lose an election is becoming kind of politically more difficult in the U.S. Add to that the concerns, very real, about potential election interference, and what we're already seeing today around misinformation and disinformation related to COVID-19 itself. This is a febrile environment for a U.S. election where a lot of people, are getting most, if not all, of their information from online sources that are particularly vulnerable and susceptible to that type of manipulation. And then combine that with what we do have, which is a real logistical challenge to that kind of voting mechanism itself that we've seen play out in the Democratic and Republican primaries over the last few months. Some of these were delayed, some of them were canceled, some of them proceeded, but 80% of polling locations were closed, and maybe there was some, if we had voter suppression or voter fraud concerns, albeit very, very undocumented ones in the last election, you can imagine what it's going to look like in this election, where we expect to see postal voting increase to probably record levels, where we expect to see, the physical places where you can go to vote be greatly reduced and have, guidance and complicated mechanisms and protocols required to access them. What is a poll worker going to do if somebody shows up and they're not wearing a mask? Will they be allowed to vote? Who knows? It kind of depends on the state rules. So there's ample scope for that to happen. And I think we do think that it increases the likelihood that on election night, we will not immediately know who won, and we will be faced with a series of legal challenges, both for the presidential election, but also for congressional elections, for state legislative and gubernatorial elections that will need to play out over the coming weeks and maybe even longer to really determine who wind up winning that election. And it's worth remembering that, we talk mostly about presidential election, but control of Congress is very important in this election as well. The Senate in particular is extremely narrowly divided. It could go either way in this cycle. It could come down very easily to kind of one race in Arizona, you mentioned earlier, or Tennessee or North Carolina. And one House race in North Carolina in 2018 midterms wasn't decided for a year until after the election. So we could be entering a very strange period in U.S. politics, maybe even unprecedented, in which there's a lot of uncertainty around what the result is, and where it's very difficult to establish a result that gains widespread legitimacy and credibility. I mean, we think this is a low likelihood scenario, but it's definitely out there.
Well, thanks for that uplifting conclusion. I will get my bunker ready. Raul, please, if you have any positive thoughts to add?
Well, get ready for my answer then. No, honestly, I'm a big believer in negative imagination. I think it's healthy to have it. I think it's healthy in understanding politics, business, and in everyday life because it makes you more prepared. Occupational hazard, obviously, but I think, and I like these questions. I mean, the idea of a Trump situation where Trump doesn't accept the result, doesn't want to leave. I mean, that's on the upper end of negative imagination. I don't know that I'd go that far. But then as far as COVID-19 effects in Latin America, politically, what we can expect, I know my people in Latin America, and history in Latin America is such that, liberal democracy is a very fragile thing, and it's not an easy thing to get. And not everybody has the history of the U.S. That has made it into sort of a liberal democracy where, these liberal ideals like free speech and human rights and all these things are of primary importance. I think in a number of countries in Latin America, and I would say in a lot of the world, I think stability and control and, political stability is sometimes more important than a lot of these rights to a lot of the folks who are voters, even though that might seem horrifying to decent liberal-minded folks like us. So I would say that, what we're going to see with COVID-19 is, yes, I mean, there might be some punishment against some politicians that did not handle things well. But, I think it would also depend a lot on the impact of COVID-19 in the economies, who gets hurt more than whom, whether the experience was particularly harsh for a particular country or not. I mean, but I think nationalism and populism are extremely formidable forces, unfortunately. And I think that it would not surprise me if we continue to see a number of these governments essentially take advantage of COVID-19 to impose a number of restrictions, to pass a number of policies that previously they were unable to pass. Yeah. So I think it might end up being sort of an opportunity for a lot of these folks, rather than an undermining, if you will, of populism.
I think, we've alluded to this already today. That is absolutely happening in Mexico. I mean, there was a direct reference to the orders from SENER and SENACE with regards to renewable generation and deployment of renewable generation by private generators that couched it in terms of the COVID-19 crisis. So I think we have a concrete example that we'll get into much more tomorrow. There you go. There's the plug for the final day of the Virtual La Jolla Conference, Mexico Day. Join us tomorrow. And no, absolutely. Joking aside, I think you're 100% correct. And we have just out of the top, that's one concrete example. There are many others, I'm sure. We'll continue to see others. All right, yes or no question, and we've got to wrap up. Thanks, everyone. Fantastic. It's almost the same as sitting around the room together. No, it's not. It's not almost the same at all. I didn't even get a drink. So, and for those of you criticizing, I'm getting some messages from people. Where's your beer? I tried to get one. If you missed my queja, I was unable to buy a beer at the little shop next door. Anyway. Personal challenge. So here's the final question. Will a Biden or Trump second administration fundamentally handle China differently? Which one? I mean, so the question is yes or no. Will there be a significant difference of posture from one administration to another? Yes or no? Jonathan?
No.
Raul?
No.
Okay. Targets on China. We still have a massive target on China. Okay. Well, this has been a fantastic virtual applause. Thank you all so much, Jonathan Wood and Raul Gallegos from Washington, D.C. and Bogota, and Control Risks. Thank you guys for supporting this. We will hopefully do this again next year in person and have everyone around the room. Thanks, everyone, for your wonderful comments and questions. It's been fantastic. It's been quite interactive. I've certainly had fun bandying around some of these ideas. So see you tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. our time out here in California, and we'll kick off Mexico Day, and we'll wrap up the Virtual La Jolla conference with a lot of Mexico. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.